This morning, our lesson comes from Lamentations, the 5th chapter. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to aliens. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. With the yoke on our necks, we are hard driven. We are weary. We are given no rest. We have made a pact with Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread. Our ancestors sinned. They are no more, and we bear their iniquities. Slaves rule over us. There is no one to deliver us from their hand. We get our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. Our skin is black as an oven from the scorching heat of famine. Women are raped in Zion, virgins in the towns of Judah. Princes are hung up by their hands. No respect is shown to the elders. Young men are compelled to grind, and the boys stagger under loads of wood. Old men have left the city gate, the young men their music. The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned to mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Because of this our heart is sick. Because of these things our eyes have grown dim. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, jackals prowl all over it. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures for all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forgotten us these many days? Restore us yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. The Book of Lamentation reflects the period of the Babylonian captivity. Assyria had taken the northern tribes of Israel into exile earlier. Only the tribe of Judah was left. But despite the warnings of many prophets, Judah continued to sin. The writer of Lamentations, is commonly taken to be Jeremiah, had warned Judah for many years that God's judgment was coming. As instruments of God's wrath, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, and many who were left alive were carried into exile. The weak and the poor was left behind, and to contend with the foreign settlers. The 5 chapters of Lamentations do not shy away from describing that devastation and its aftermath. Lack of food resulted in starvation and cannibalism. Those who did not die with the sword were weak with hunger and with disease. So this is kind of a depressing lesson today. In verse 1 it says, remember, Lord, what has happened to us, and look and see our disgrace. Asking God to remember is not primarily a plea for him to look or recall information, but for him to act. And it says, look and see, and they both echo wanting to remember. Putting these 3 verbs together conveys the sense of urgency for God to see what was happening to his people and to act without delay. The phrase, what has happened to us, suggests that the people saw themselves as passive recipients of the tragedy that had befallen them. The phrase, our disgrace, is parallel. But the people's circumstances were because of their sins, not a mere twist of fate. So it says, our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. The inheritance is the promised land, and it was of great importance to Israel, and it was a sign of God's faithful promise to Abraham and continued faithfulness to Abraham's descendants. And laws govern inheritance to ensure that no one in Israel will lose the family's land permanently. And imagine then how devastating it was for that inheritance, with all its God's ordained safeguards, to be lost to strangers. The lands falling into the hands of people who were outside of God's covenant jeopardized Judah's ever being able to get it back. It says, we have become fatherless. Our mothers are widows. Orphans and widows were protected people under God's covenant. They would be taken under the wings of the community so that they could thrive in less than ideal situations. So in a horrible reversal of fortune, God's judgment has created widows and orphans in Judah, just as he had warned. In verse 4 it says, we must buy the water we drink. Our wood can be had only at a price. Both water and wood in the Promised Land had been given to the Israelites for their use. Having to buy these from the invaders from Babylon emphasized that the land was no longer controlled by Judah. So this suggested to the mourners that God had abandoned the covenant that he had made with them. In verse 5 it says, those who pursue us are at our heels. We are weary and find no rest. This verse recalls the persecution and endless labor that Israel had experienced in Egypt. After the Lord had delivered Israel from slavery, he had revealed his laws to them, and that law included the command to rest on the Sabbath. So being forced to break that common command by those who were chosen to carry out God's judgment was seemingly more evidence of God's distance and abandonment. It says, we submit to Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread. The people of Assyria were foes more recent than those from Egypt. The fact that the Judeans asked these two antagonistic nations for help indicates the desperate consequences of the Babylonian conquest. And bread was a staple food, was a basic food, really. It was something that the people had been able to make for themselves as long as they could sow the grain and reap it. They could have their own food. And it says reference to bread cannot imply food of any kind, but they just think about it as bread. That was their food. So the need to appeal to Assyria and Egypt for aid could have been resulted from the fields having been devastated by the Babylonian army. It says, our ancestors sinned in verse 7 and are no more, and we bear their punishment. In many places, the Bible affirms that each person suffers for his or her own wrongdoing. However, biblical precedent exists for a generation to suffer the sins of its ancestors. And so the curses that God included in the covenant as potential discipline clearly expressed that people who were not originally guilty parties would suffer, that it would be passed down. It says, those who lifted up their voices in the lament certainly felt the results of the sins of the previous generations. So that's an example that it was handed on down. But throughout those generations, God had warned about judgment. Even more, God had promised to relent from punishment when the people repented. You know, they would sin and he'd punish, and he said he would relent if they would repent. In verse 8 it says, slaves rule over us, and there is no one to free us from their hands. Judah lost its kings when one surrendered to the besiegers and his replacement rebelled. And so these people taken to Babylon were ruled by the Babylonian slaves there, while those left in Judah had to obey similar servants. Those who remained behind suffered the shame of being governed by foreigners within the boundaries of the Promised Land, which that was very troubling to them. So it says, in verse 9, we get our bread at the risk of our lives and because of the sword in the desert. There may not have been much more to eat than bread in the land, but the sword represents all the violence that people still feared and experienced. Its appearance in the desert probably refers to the special dangers of trying to harvest any food, and that's it. They would get in trouble if they were trying to harvest food that they had not planted. So it said our skin is hot as an oven, feverish from hunger. It says the reference to an oven may be the way referred to a raven. Our skin is hot, calls to mind food that has been burned in the oven. If you can imagine how hot that was to burn the food, that's how these people felt about it says their skin was hot as an oven. The great hunger that the famine created has opened the door to all kinds of ailments. Verse 11 says, women had been violated in Zion and virgins in the town of Judah. Women and virgins are terms that refer to adult females. Whether they were married or not, they suffered sexual violations throughout Zion and the towns of Judah. And God's laws established punishment for these sexual violations, but to the invaders, that didn't mean anything because they didn't go by God's laws. Princes have been hung up by their hands. The prince, it's representing the monarchy, and advisors perhaps had expected treatment in accordance with their positions. If they were a prince, you would think they would be pretty far up the ladder. Being executed in a public way, such as implied here, where they hung them up by their hands, was a big indignity. And the spectacle of their deaths was meant to remind the people of their powerlessness. It says the elders are shown no respect in verse 12b. The elders were due reverence based on their wisdom that was gained with age because they were older people. And it seems likely that the dishonor that was afforded them was also public execution, which they would hang them up and just leave them hanging there. And it says the fate of King Zedekiah comes to mind. The last thing that he saw before they gouged his eyes out was the slaughter of his sons and daughters and all of his officials. Then the king was bound and taken to Babylon prison where he died. So this was some cruel things that was going on at that time. It says young men toil at the millstone, boys stagger under heavy loads. Typically it was female slaves who did the grinding of the grain, but this task had fallen to the younger men who would have been suited better to a different task. And in contrast, boys were given much work that was much too difficult for them. It said in verse 14, the elders are gone from the city gates, the young men have stopped their music. The gated cities like Jerusalem, elders congregated at the gate to decide legal cases, to reach business agreements and stuff like that. And the lack of music further reveals the cultural upheaval that is the evidence throughout this book. And so then it says in verse 15, back to the verse, the young men are the one that's doing the grinding now instead of doing the music and the women doing the grinding. It says, joy is gone from our hearts. Our dancing has turned to mourning. In Psalms 31-3, the psalmist rejoiced in God's deliverance from enemies and sickness. The opposite is seen here. The conquered people suffered from both, with joy turning to mourning. And it was hopeless. Their current situation seemed to them, which it was pretty hopeless at that time. Verse 16a, it says, the crown has fallen from our crown, represented the monarchy. The monarchy itself represented Judah. It says, woe to us, for we have sinned. In verse 16b, it said, these mourners had claimed that they suffered for previous generations sinned. And here they take the responsibility for their own sin. And of course, the word woe expresses their grief for their sin. Verse 17 and 18, it says, because of this our hearts are faint. Because of these things our eyes grow dim for Mount Zion, which lies desolate, with jackals prowling over it. Weakness of hearts and eyes resulted from the fate of Mount Zion. So we do not need to assume Jeremiah had only one of these specific ideas in mind. After all, the people mourned for the fate of the city, the monarchy, and the temple. The presence of jackals at the heart of the capital city marks the profound desolation of Judah. And all of this, everything had come to an end, and jackals was all over the city and everything, so things were not going well. Of the Lord's reign, in verse 19, you, Lord, reign over forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Although the Lord had been addressed throughout the chapter, he has not been called out since verse 1. And we're well down the line now. This absence emphasizes the feeling of distance that the people felt. The call on him now is a brief moment of praise. To speak of God's eternal throne emphasizes his role as king. It is he who has the power and authority to decide and impose punishment. Having existed from generation to generation, he knows how unfaithful those generations have been. So yet knowing that God's presence can be counted on can be a source of comfort, even if in the current moment he seems far off. Verse 20, why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us so long? The Lord does not forget his people, as though his memory is faulted. Yet knowing that God is indeed from generation to generation makes the question of his forsaking all the more painful. Though Jeremiah had offered words of encouragement previously, those seem to be a drop in the bucket in light of what the overwhelming pain that continued. In verse 21a, it says, restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. The language of returning speaks of repentance, and the people did return to the Lord as they should. And so their history proved that they struggled to turn to God on their own. For this reason, they asked God that God would give his grace to them by turning them himself. They couldn't do it themselves, so they're asking God to turn them back to him. It says, renew our days as of old.